Mommy, what does burden mean? My 8-year-old son's voice cut through the crystal-clinking silence of the country club like a blade. 200 wedding guests turned to stare at us, the single mother in the discount dress, and her innocent child who had just exposed the cruelty hidden beneath polite society's smile. 30 seconds earlier, my cousin Tessa had raised her champagne flute and delivered her poisonous toast about people who make choices that affect innocent children, while looking straight at me. 30 seconds earlier, I had been just another unwanted guest at table 9, trying to make myself invisible. Now, I was the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. Are we burdens, Mommy? The question hung in the perfumed air like an accusation. I felt my mother's mortified gaze burning into me from across the room. I saw Tessa's perfect smile falter. I watched as Dylan, the groom, the man I had once saved from living in his car, went pale as death at the head table. My son waited for an answer, his small hand clutching mine, completely unaware that he had just shattered the carefully constructed facade of a family that had spent 8 years pretending we didn't exist. This was the moment everything changed, but to understand how we got here, how a single mother and her son ended up as the unwanted truth-tellers at a fairy tale wedding, I need to take you back to where it all began. I traced the embossed letters with my finger, remembering the last family gathering 3 years ago when my cousin Tessa had announced her engagement to Dylan. The room had erupted in congratulations, champagne flutes clinking like tiny bells celebrating a future I would never be part of. I had smiled from the corner of my aunt's living room, holding my then 5-year-old son's hand, watching as promises of forever filled the air around us. Nobody had asked about my forever. Nobody had wondered about the father who disappeared the moment 2 pink lines appeared on a pregnancy test, leaving behind nothing but empty promises and a forwarding address that led nowhere. They didn't ask about the nights I worked double shifts at the diner while my son slept on a cot in the employee break room, or how I studied for my GED by the light of my phone while he did homework at the kitchen table of our cramped apartment. What they saw was simpler, cleaner, the family disappointment, the cautionary tale whispered behind closed doors. The girl who got herself in trouble, and now served as a living reminder of what happened when you made poor choices. Every family gathering became an exercise in subtle judgment, sideways glances, and conversations that stopped when I entered the room. My son's school backpack hit the floor with a thud as he bounded through the door, his uniform wrinkled, and his shoelaces trailing behind him like streamers. His smile was immediate and bright, the way only children could smile after a long day, full of stories and excitement. "Mommy, what are you reading?" He pressed against my side, trying to peek at the invitation. "It's from Cousin Tessa. She's getting married." "The pretty one with the yellow hair?" "Yes, sweetheart. Are we invited?" I looked down at his upturned face, at eyes that held the same quiet strength that had carried us through 8 years of barely making ends meet. How could I explain that invitations in our family came with conditions? That love was conditional. Acceptance required conformity to standards we had never been able to meet? "I think so," I said carefully. "Will there be dancing? I've been practicing at school." His enthusiasm broke something loose in my chest. Here was this beautiful, innocent child who still believed the world was fundamentally good, that family meant safety and celebration. He had never learned to read the subtle cruelties that adults perfected, never noticed the way conversations shifted when we walked into rooms. The truth was more complicated than a simple invitation. Dylan had been more than just Tessa's fiancé to me once. 5 years ago, when my world was falling apart, and his was crumbling too, we had found each other in the shared desperation of rock bottom. He had been living in his car then, jobless and hopeless, when I encountered him outside the community center where I volunteered on weekends, one of the few places where my struggles felt purposeful rather than shameful. I remembered that rainy October afternoon when I found him sitting on the steps, staring at nothing with eyes that had given up. His clothes were clean but worn, his hair longer than it should have been, his hands shaking slightly in the cold. Something about his stillness, his careful distance from the people passing by, reminded me of myself in those first months after my son's father left. I had been carrying 2 sandwiches sewn for my lunch, one for the road when I approached him. "Excuse me, are you waiting for the center to open?" He looked up with the wariness of someone who had learned not to trust kindness. "No, just sitting." "Would you like a sandwich?" "I made too many." That small lie had opened a door between us. Over the next hour, Sitting on those concrete steps, he told me about losing his job at the accounting firm, about his landlord's eviction notice, about the slow dissolution of a life he had worked so hard to build. I told him about the housing assistance program, about the job placement services, about the food pantry that didn't ask questions. I had driven him to the social services office and waited with him for 3 hours while he filled out forms and spoke with counselors. I had helped him apply for jobs, given him my phone number as a reference when he had none, and watched as he slowly, painfully, rebuilt his life from nothing. But that was before Tessa, before he became someone worthy of my family's approval, before I became someone they preferred to forget entirely. 3 weeks passed before I made my choice. The invitation sat on my kitchen counter like a small, persistent question I couldn't answer. Every morning I would see it while making coffee, and every night it would be there when I came home from work, patient and unyielding. My mother called on a Sunday evening, her voice carrying that familiar mixture of duty and disapproval that had soundtracked my entire adult life. "You received the invitation, I assume?" "Yes, Mom." "Good. Tessa hopes you'll attend. It would mean a great deal to the family to have everyone there." The words she didn't say hung in the air between us like smoke. "But leave your complications at home. Don't remind us of your choices. Don't make this about you. Asterisk. Don't bring the child who represents everything this family prefers to ignore." "The wedding is at the country club," she continued. "Very elegant. Very appropriate. I trust you'll dress accordingly." Appropriately. Asterisk. The word had followed me for years, a constant reminder that I existed outside the boundaries of what my family considered acceptable. Appropriate meant expensive clothes I couldn't afford, meant pretending my struggles didn't exist, meant smiling while they discussed lives I would never have access to. "I'll be there," I heard myself saying, though I hadn't consciously made the decision. Wonderful. And remember, this is Tessa's day. Let's not complicate things with unnecessary drama or attention-seeking. After I hung up, I stood in my small kitchen, looking at the single dress in my closet that might be suitable for a wedding. It was navy blue, purchased from a consignment shop for a job interview 4 years ago, altered twice to accommodate my changing body and circumstances. The hem was slightly uneven where I had shortened it myself, and there was a small stain near the waist that only I could see, but it would have to do. My son found me there an hour later, standing in front of my open closet door like it might reveal secrets if I stared long enough. "Mommy, you look sad." I turned to find him in his Spider-Man pajamas, hair still damp from his bath, holding the stuffed elephant he had slept with since he was 2. The elephant was gray and worn, one ear slightly chewed, but he loved it with the fierce loyalty that only children could muster. "I'm not sad, baby, just thinking." "About the wedding?" "Yes." "Are we going?" I knelt down to his eye level, searching for words that wouldn't break his heart or fill him with the anxiety that had become my constant companion. "Yes, we're going." His face lit up like Christmas morning. "Will there be cake?" "Probably the best cake you've ever had." "Will they be happy to see us?" The question cut through all my careful explanations and diplomatic non-answers. How could I tell him that happiness, in our family, was contingent on conformity to standards we could never meet? That love came with conditions we had never been able to fulfill? "Some people show happiness differently than others, sweetheart. But we're going because family is important, even when it's complicated." What does complicated mean? It means that sometimes people we love don't know how to love us back the right way, but we love them anyway. He considered this with the seriousness of someone much older, filing away another piece of information about the adult world that didn't quite make sense. "Will I get to dance?" "If you want to dance, we'll dance. Even if no one else wants to dance with us?" The question broke my heart and mended it at the same time. Here was my son, 8 years old, already understanding that we existed on the margins of acceptance, but still believing that joy was possible even in the shadows. "Especially then," I said, pulling him into a hug that smelled like soap and innocence. "We'll dance like nobody's watching." The morning of the wedding arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made everything feel possible. I spent an hour getting ready, applying makeup with the careful precision of someone who knew they would be scrutinized, styling my hair into something that approximated elegance, and choosing jewelry that wouldn't scream discount store. My son wore his only dress shirt, carefully ironed that morning, and dark pants that were slightly too short but clean and pressed. I had spent 20 minutes working gel through his cowlicks, trying to tame hair that insisted on sticking up in ways that made him look younger than his 8 years. "Do I look handsome, Mommy?" "You look like the most handsome boy in the whole world." "Do you look beautiful?" I checked my reflection one more time in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at me was tired but determined, wearing a dress that had seen better days but was clean and appropriate. My makeup couldn't quite hide the exhaustion that came from working 60-hour weeks, but it would have to be enough. "I look like me," I said. "That's the most beautiful," he replied without hesitation, and for a moment, I believed him. The country club parking lot was filled with luxury vehicles I recognized from family, social media posts, Mercedes, BMWs, Audis gleaming in the afternoon sun like monuments to success I would never achieve. I parked my 10-year-old sedan in the back corner, hoping it would be less noticeable among the displays of prosperity. The building itself was imposing, all stone and glass and carefully maintained landscaping that whispered money in ways I was still learning to interpret. A uniformed valet approached as we walked toward the entrance, then stopped when he saw my car, his smile fading into polite disinterest. The moment we walked through the massive oak doors, I felt the familiar weight of being observed and found wanting. Conversations paused mid-sentence as we entered, eyes tracking our movement across the marble foyer like we were specimens in a museum. The air smelled like expensive flowers and perfume that cost more than my monthly rent. My Aunt Linda was the first to greet us, her smile brittle as porcelain as she air-kissed my cheek, her gaze never quite meeting mine but cataloging my appearance with the efficiency of someone conducting an inventory. "How lovely that you could make it," she said, her voice carrying the practiced politeness of someone fulfilling an obligation. "And this must be." She paused, looking down at my son as if trying to remember his name. "This is my son," I said simply, my hand finding his shoulder. "Of course, how? Nice." The word nice hung in the air like a judgment disguised as courtesy. My son, bless him, smiled up at her with the guileless enthusiasm of childhood. "Thank you for inviting us to the party," he said politely, the words we had practiced in the car. "Yes, well, family is family," she replied, already scanning the room for someone more important to greet. We were directed to table 9, positioned near the kitchen entrance and far from the family tables clustered around the head table where Tessa and Dylan would sit. The centerpiece was smaller than the others, the linen slightly less crisp, the overall effect clearly indicating that we were included but not celebrated. My son didn't notice the subtle hierarchy of seating arrangements. He was fascinated by the ice sculptures shaped like swans, the elaborate floral arrangements that looked like they belonged in a museum, the way the light caught the crystal glasses and threw rainbows across the white tablecloths. "Look, Mommy, they have swans made of ice. How do they do that?" His wonder was infectious, cutting through my anxiety like sunlight through clouds. For a moment, I forgot about the whispers and sideways glances, lost in his excitement about a world that was magical and new. "They use special tools to carve the ice," I explained, grateful for his distraction from my own discomfort. "Can we make ice swans at home?" "We can try." Other guests began filling the seats around distant relatives and family friends, who nodded politely but didn't introduce themselves, clearly understanding the social geography that placed us at the margins of acceptance. The couple to our left spoke in hushed tones about stock portfolios and vacation homes. The woman to our right spent 10 minutes discussing her daughter's acceptance to an Ivy League school. I listened to these conversations with a mixture of envy and alienation, understanding that I existed in a different world, entirely one, where success was measured in survival rather than accumulation, where achievement meant keeping your child fed and housed rather than accepted to prestigious universities. The reception moved through its choreographed stages with the precision of expensive event planning. Cocktails were served by waiters in crisp white jackets, hors d'oeuvres circulated on silver trays, and photographers captured every moment for posterity. My son and I existed on the periphery of it all, observers rather than participants in the celebration of Tessa and Dylan's perfect love. Dinner was served with the kind of attention to detail that money could buy: multiple courses, wine pairings, presentation that looked like art. My son was impressed by everything, trying escargot for the first time and declaring it interesting but slimy, asking questions about every unfamiliar dish with the curiosity that made him such a joy to be around. The speeches began after the main course, a series of toasts that painted Dylan and Tessa as the perfect couple, destined for the kind of happiness that seemed to exist only in fairy tales. Dylan's best man told stories about college adventures and career successes. Tessa's maid of honor spoke about friendship and loyalty and finding your soulmate. Then came the moment I had been dreading without knowing why. Tessa stood, champagne flute in hand, her smile radiant as she addressed the room. She looked like a princess in her ivory silk gown, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless despite hours of celebration. She was everything I had never been: polished, appropriate, worthy of approval. "I want to thank everyone who has supported Dylan and me on this journey," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the room. "Family is everything, and I'm so grateful to be surrounded by people who understand the importance of commitment, responsibility, and making choices that honor those we love." Her gaze found mine across the room, and I felt something cold settle in my stomach. In today's world, it's so easy to make decisions based on momentary desires rather than long-term consequences. So easy to choose paths that seem right in the moment but end up affecting not just ourselves, but innocent children who deserve better than to pay the price for their parents' mistakes. The silence that followed was deafening. I felt every eye in the room turn toward me, felt the weight of judgment settling on my shoulders like a heavy cloak. My mother's face was a mask of mortification. My Aunt Linda whispered something to her dinner companion behind her napkin. "Tonight, I'm grateful to be marrying a man who understands that family means putting others first, making sacrifices for the greater good, and not being a burden that others have to carry. Dylan has shown me what it means to think beyond your own immediate needs and consider the impact of your choices on the people who love you." My son tugged at my sleeve, his voice small and confused. "Mommy, what does burden mean?" His question cut through the tension like a knife, innocent and devastating in its honesty. The adults around us shifted uncomfortably, suddenly forced to confront the cruelty of words spoken in polite company. I wanted to disappear, to grab my son and run from this room, full of people who saw us as cautionary tales, rather than human beings deserving of basic dignity. But something deeper than embarrassment kept me in my chair. Perhaps the stubborn pride that had carried me through 8 years of single parenthood, or the sudden understanding that my son was watching to see how I would respond to cruelty disguised as celebration. "It means something heavy that someone has to carry," I whispered back, my voice steady despite the tears threatening to spill over. "Are we burdens?" The question hung in the air, asked with the devastating honesty of childhood. Around us, conversations had stopped entirely, the room holding its breath as they waited to see how this awkward moment would resolve itself. I saw my mother close her eyes, saw Tessa's smile falter for just a moment, before reasserting itself with renewed determination. I saw Dylan at the head table, his face pale and uncertain, looking between his new wife and the woman who had once saved his life. "No, sweetheart," I said, loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. "We're not burdens, we're family. And family means loving people even when they don't know how to love you back." The weight of the room's attention was suffocating. I could feel my carefully constructed composure beginning to crack under the pressure of public humiliation disguised as wedding celebration. My son's innocent question had exposed the cruelty that adults perfected through politeness, and now we sat in the wreckage of pretense, surrounded by people who were suddenly forced to confront their own complicity in our marginalization. I stood to leave, my dignity shredded, but my resolve intact. My son deserved better than this. He deserved to grow up knowing his worth wasn't determined by other people's capacity for cruelty or their inability to see past their own prejudices. "Come on, sweetheart," I said quietly, reaching for his hand. "Let's go home." "But we haven't had cake yet," he protested, still not understanding the full weight of what had just happened. "We'll get cake somewhere else. Better cake." As I gathered my small purse and helped my son from his chair, I caught glimpses of faces around the room, some sympathetic, some embarrassed, most simply relieved that the uncomfortable moment would soon pass. This was how it always worked. The inconvenient people removed themselves, and everyone else could return to pretending that cruelty didn't exist in polite society. But as I took my son's hand and prepared to walk out of that room with whatever dignity I could salvage, Dylan appeared at the microphone. The room fell silent, expecting another toast, another celebration of their perfect love story, another chapter in the fairy tale that would erase the awkwardness of the previous few minutes. Instead, he looked directly at me, his expression serious and intense in a way that made the room hold its breath. "Before we continue tonight's celebration," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly silent room, "I need to say something important, something I should have said a long time ago." The room held its breath. Tessa's smile became fixed, uncertain, as she looked between her new husband and the woman who was supposed to disappear quietly into the night. "5 years ago I was living in my car," Dylan continued, his voice steady despite the obvious difficulty of the confession. "I had lost my job, my apartment, my savings, and my hope. I was sitting outside the community center on a rainy Thursday afternoon, trying to figure out how to end the pain, when someone approached me. My heart began to race. Surely he wouldn't. Someone who didn't know me, didn't owe me anything, but saw that I was drowning and threw me a lifeline without asking what I had done to deserve rescue." The room was completely silent now, the kind of silence that comes when people realize they're witnessing something that will change how they see everything that came before. "She bought me lunch with money she probably couldn't spare. She drove me to the housing assistance office and waited with me for 3 hours while I filled out forms and tried to figure out how to rebuild a life from nothing. She helped me apply for jobs when I had no references, gave me her phone number as a contact when I had nowhere else to turn, and never once asked what I had done to deserve help." I felt tears streaming down my face, but they weren't tears of shame anymore. They were tears of recognition, of finally being seen for who I truly was, rather than what I represented to people who had never bothered to look deeper. She saw value in me when I couldn't see it in myself. She believed in my potential when I had forgotten I had any. She treated me with dignity when I felt like I deserved nothing. The transformation in the room was palpable. Whispers began at the edges, not of judgment but of understanding, as people began to reassess everything they thought they knew about the woman at table 9. Dylan's voice grew stronger, more passionate, as he continued his unexpected confession. "That woman is sitting right there," he said, pointing directly at me with a certainty that silenced every whisper in the room. "And if any of you have ever thought I was worth celebrating, worth loving, worth inviting into your family, you need to understand that it started with her compassion, with her refusal to walk past someone who was suffering." Tessa's face had gone white, her champagne flute trembling slightly in her hand. My mother was staring at me as if seeing me for the first time, her expression cycling through confusion, recognition, and something that might have been shame. "She was already a single mother," Dylan continued, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "already struggling, already judged by people who should have supported her, already working 2 jobs, and going to school and raising a child who is, by the way, one of the kindest, smartest, most resilient kids I've ever met." My son's hand found mine, his small fingers intertwining with mine as he looked up at Dylan with wide eyes, beginning to understand that the man at the microphone was talking about us, about me, in a way that no one ever had before. But she still had room in her heart for one more person who needed help. She still had the capacity to see suffering and respond with kindness rather than judgment. She saved my life, and she never asked for anything in return. She never told anyone what she had done. She never used it as leverage or expected gratitude or recognition. The room was transfixed now, hanging on every word as Dylan painted a picture of generosity and grace that stood in stark contrast to the judgment and exclusion they had just witnessed. She just helped because helping was the right thing to do, because she understood that sometimes people need someone to believe in them before they can believe in themselves. Because she had been through her own struggles and knew what it felt like to need grace and receive judgment instead. I could see the impact of his words rippling through the room like stones thrown into still water. Faces that had been cold or indifferent moments before were now looking at me with curiosity, with respect, with something approaching admiration. "So when I hear people talk about burden," Dylan said, his voice growing fierce with conviction, "about responsibility, about what family means, I think about a woman who embodies all of those things in the most beautiful way possible. I think about someone who has never stopped putting others first, who has never stopped fighting for what's right, who has never stopped believing that love is an action, not just a feeling." The applause began slowly, uncertainly, as people processed this sudden shift in perspective. But it grew, building into something that felt genuine and transformative rather than the polite acknowledgement that had followed other speeches. My son stood up on his chair, his voice clear and proud as he addressed the room with the fearless confidence of childhood. "That's my mommy," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "She's the strongest person I know, and she makes the best pancakes, and she reads me stories even when she's tired, and she teaches me that being kind is more important than being rich." The room listened in rapt attention as he continued, his words carrying a wisdom that silenced every adult present. "She says that how people treat you says more about them than it does about you. And she says that love isn't about being perfect, it's about being there." His innocent articulation of truths that adults had forgotten or chosen to ignore created a moment of clarity that cut through years of judgment and assumption. In his simple honesty, he had distilled the essence of what really mattered: presence over perfection, kindness over convention, love over judgment. As the applause died down, I remained seated, overwhelmed by the sudden shift in the room's energy. The same people who had whispered about me and avoided eye contact just minutes before were now looking at me with something approaching reverence, as if seeing me clearly for the first time. The transformation was both gratifying and heartbreaking gratifying because finally, someone had spoken the truth about who I was and what I had done. Heartbreaking because it had taken someone else's testimony to make my own family see my worth. My mother was the first to approach our table, moving slowly as if walking through water, her eyes red with tears I had never seen her shed. She knelt beside my chair, her carefully styled hair slightly disheveled, her expensive dress forgotten in the moment. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking on the words. "I'm so sorry for what I said, for what I didn't say, for all the times I should have protected you instead of judging you, for all the times I chose appearances over my own daughter." The apology I had waited 8 years to hear came with the weight of accumulated pain and the possibility of healing. I looked at this woman who had raised me, who had loved me imperfectly but consistently, who had struggled with her own fears and limitations while trying to navigate a world that punished deviation from expectations. "Mom," I said simply, reaching out to touch her trembling hand. "I was scared," she continued, tears flowing freely now. "Scared of what people would think, scared of being judged alongside you, scared of not knowing how to help or what to say. So I said nothing, and that was worse than saying the wrong thing." Tessa appeared beside her, no longer the radiant bride but a woman confronting an uncomfortable truth about herself and her new husband's past. Her perfect makeup was slightly smudged, her confident demeanor replaced by something more vulnerable and uncertain. "I had no idea," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the quiet conversations that had resumed around us. "Dylan never told me how you two met. I thought you assumed I was a mistake," I said gently without accusation. "A cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when someone makes poor choices." She nodded, unable to meet my eyes, her shame palpable and genuine. "But we all make choices," I continued, my voice steady despite the emotional weight of the moment. "And sometimes the hardest choices lead to the most beautiful outcomes. My son is not a burden or a mistake or a consequence to be ashamed of. He's the best thing I've ever done, the most important choice I've ever made, and I would make it again 1,000 times over." The conversations around us had quieted again as people strained to hear this exchange, this moment of reckoning that was unfolding in the middle of what was supposed to be a celebration. "I know that my life doesn't look like yours," I said, addressing not just Tessa but the room at large. "I know that single motherhood and financial struggle and working-class jobs don't fit the picture of success that this family celebrates. But success isn't just about money or status or meeting other people's expectations. Sometimes it's about surviving. Sometimes it's about choosing love over fear. Sometimes it's about helping someone else when you barely have enough to help yourself." My son reached over and hugged my arm, his small body warm against my side. "My mommy is successful," he announced to the room with the absolute certainty of childhood. "She takes care of me and helps other people and makes everything better when it's broken." His words created another moment of profound silence, as adults were forced to confront their own definitions of worth and achievement through the lens of a child's uncomplicated love. As the evening wound down, I found myself at the center of conversations I had never expected to have. Cousins who had avoided me for years approached our table to ask about my son's school, my work, my dreams for the future. Aunts who had whispered about me behind closed doors now spoke to me with genuine interest and respect, as if discovering a relative they had never known existed. The shift was both wonderful and surreal. These were the same people who had marginalized me for years, yet now they were eager to connect, to understand, to be associated with the woman who had been publicly acknowledged as someone worth celebrating. But the most meaningful moment came when Dylan approached me privately, away from the crowd and the cameras and the performance of social interaction. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of years of gratitude he had never been able to express. For that day 5 years ago, and for tonight, for showing me what real strength looks like, and for reminding me that dignity isn't about what you have, it's about who you are. "You didn't have to do that," I replied, gesturing toward the microphone where he had changed everything with his honesty. "You didn't owe me anything. I owed you everything," he said with quiet intensity. "My job, my home, my ability to be the man Tessa fell in love with, all of it started with your kindness. But more than that, your son deserved to see his mother honored for who she really is. He deserved to witness what happens when truth prevails over assumption." I looked across the room to where my son was now engaged in animated conversation with his newly attentive extended family, his earlier confusion replaced by the confidence that came from seeing his mother defended and celebrated. "He's remarkable," Dylan continued, following my gaze. "Confident and kind and wise in ways that most adults never achieve. That doesn't happen by accident. That's the result of extraordinary parenting under extraordinary circumstances." As we prepared to leave, my son ran back to the dessert table for one last piece of cake, navigating the room with newfound confidence as people stopped to talk with him, to compliment his politeness, to acknowledge his existence in ways they never had before. "Are you ready to go home?" I asked when he returned, chocolate frosting at the corner of his mouth. "Can we come to more family parties?" he asked hopefully, clutching a small wrapped piece of cake he had saved for later. I looked around the room at faces that had transformed from judgmental to welcoming, at relatives who were seeing us clearly for the first time, at a family that was slowly learning to expand their definition of worth and success. "We'll see," I said, meaning it in a way I never had before. As we walked to the car through the cool evening air, my son's hand warm in mine, I felt different than I had in years. Not because my circumstances had changed tomorrow. I would still wake up in the same small apartment, still face the same financial challenges, still navigate the daily struggle of raising a child alone. But because my truth had been acknowledged, because my worth had been recognized, because my son had witnessed grace in action and justice prevailing over judgment. "Mommy?" he said as we drove home through the quiet streets. "Yes, baby? I'm proud of you. I'm proud of you too. Even when people are mean? Especially when people are mean. That's when being proud matters most." He was quiet for a moment, processing the evening's events with the seriousness of someone much older, filing away lessons about dignity and truth and the power of speaking up for what's right. "Will they be nicer to us now?" "Maybe," I said honestly, "but it doesn't matter as much as it used to. We know who we are, and that's enough. Can I tell my friends at school about tonight?" "What would you tell them?" "That my mommy is a hero, and that she taught me how to be brave even when people don't understand you." I pulled into our driveway, this small duplex that had been our sanctuary for 3 years. It wasn't much by most standards: 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen where we did homework and ate dinner and talked about our days, but it was ours. It was filled with love and laughter and the kind of memories that money couldn't buy. That night, as I tucked my son into bed, he looked up at me with eyes full of questions and understanding, processing the complexity of adult relationships and family dynamics with the wisdom that comes from experiencing both cruelty and kindness in the same evening. "Mommy, why didn't you tell them about helping Dylan before?" "Because sometimes the most important things we do aren't meant to be talked about. They're just meant to be done." "But it made them see you differently." "Yes, it did. But the most important thing is that it didn't change who I am. I was the same person before they knew and after they knew. The only thing that changed was their understanding." He nodded solemnly, another piece of wisdom filed away for future reference. "I love you, Mommy. I love you too, sweetheart, more than all the stars in the sky. As I turned off his light and walked to my own room, I caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at me was the same one who had dressed carefully that morning, hoping to blend in and avoid confrontation, but something in her eyes was different now. Something stronger, more confident, more at peace with the truth of who she was and what she had accomplished. I had spent years apologizing for my existence, for my choices, for my son's very presence in the world. Tonight, I had been reminded that some choices are worth celebrating, that some struggles produce strength, that some burdens are actually blessings in disguise. My phone buzzed with text messages from family members' apologies and invitations and promises to do better, to include us, to see us as we truly were rather than as symbols of their own fears and judgments. I read them with gratitude but without desperation. Their acceptance was welcome, but it was no longer necessary for my peace. I had learned something important tonight, that dignity isn't something other people can give you or take away. It's something you carry within yourself, nurtured by your choices, and strengthened by your convictions. It's built through years of small acts of kindness, daily sacrifices, and the stubborn refusal to let other people's limitations define your worth. Tomorrow, I would wake up in the same small house, face the same financial challenges, and continue the same daily struggle of raising a child alone. But I would do it with the knowledge that my worth had been publicly acknowledged, that my sacrifices had been recognized, and that my son had witnessed the power of truth to transform perception and restore dignity. More importantly, I would do it knowing that kindness is never wasted, that compassion always matters, and that sometimes the very things that make us different are the things that make us valuable. I would continue to be the mother who chose love over fear, presence over perfection, and grace over grudges. And when my son woke up tomorrow morning and asked me to tell him again about the night when everyone finally saw his mommy the way he had always seen her, I would tell him the truth. That the most important audience had been sitting right beside me at table 9, learning that love doesn't require approval, that worth doesn't require validation, and that sometimes the greatest victories are the quiet ones that happen in your own heart. The recognition was wonderful, but it paled in comparison to the knowledge that I had raised a child who understood kindness, who stood up for what was right, who saw strength in struggle and beauty in imperfection. That was the real success, the true victory, the achievement that no one could take away or diminish with their approval or disapproval. As I drifted off to sleep, I smiled thinking about Dylan's words and my son's pride, but mostly I smiled thinking about tomorrow, about pancakes and homework and bedtime stories, about the ordinary moments that made up our extraordinary life, about the love that had sustained us through 8 years of existing on the margins and would continue to sustain us now that we had been invited back to the center.